she's answered, but she's got to get her video up. Here we are, video.
Oh.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you, everybody?
Good.
Pretty good, pretty good. You know what I'll do? I'll put my headphones on because it might be better because then we won't get feedback. So let me see how I can do this.
So cool.
Then let's try that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I can hear you very clearly, even though I look a bit funny with these headphones on. There. So, well, this is an impressive list of questions that you guys sent me. My goodness, you've been working really, really, really hard.
I think so. They have. All right. You girls ready to go?
Yes.
We're all ready for you. So you're
Okay.
gonna go.
Hello.
Hi.
Nice and clear.
Class, and we have some questions for you.
Yes, I know. So go ahead, fire away.
We have some introductory questions first.
Okay.
So Adrian.
Hi, I'm Adria. How long have you been a neuroscientist?
Oh, Adrian, I've been doing neuroscience for about 30 years. That's a long time. Yeah, pretty shocking, isn't it? I like your facial expressions when I told you the answer to that question. That was great.
Nice and clear, Adrian.
Hi, I'm David, and I want to know what made you want to study neuroscience?
I was always fascinated about the brain, and I always wanted to learn new things about the brain and to discover new things about the brain.
Okay.
It's just cool. It's my favorite organ in the body.
All right. Wait, don't leave.
I was wondering what courses and programs did you earn to become a neuroscientist?
Okay, well, I did quite a few. I did, after I finished high school, I did a science degree, and I did all my schooling in Australia. Okay, so we learned to write upside down relative to you. Someone got the joke.
Yeah.
Okay, so I did all my schooling in Australia, and so I went to university and did a bachelor's degree in science, and then I did a master's degree in science, and both of those were in physics. And then after that, I did a doctorate, and that was in neuroscience. So there was a lot of going to school, but it was kind of fun.
That's a lot of
It was fun, yeah.
Okay, don't leave the frame till your question's answered. Go
Hi,
ahead.
I'm Elizabeth. Do you think it was more difficult to become a scientist as a female than it would have been if you were a male?
That's a really interesting question in this day and age. And when I went to university the first time, I was a student in the late 1970s. Okay, 1978 was when I was in my first year at university. And that was an interesting time because back then there was a lot of talk about, there was a movement for equality for women and things like that. And I did a physics degree, and honestly, I didn't have any trouble at all related to the fact that I was a woman. And we were talking about that a lot back then. And it's kind of funny that now, all these years later, the same thing's happening. So I'm kind of surprised to hear that that's happening again.
Also, were there many other females in your classes?
Yeah, when I did my first degree at university, I did a fairly small course, and there was only like 24 of us in our course that started, and there were 5 girls out of the 24 of us. And then in the end, 16 people altogether out of the 24 finished, and I was the only girl. So that was that.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
We also read that you were a photographer. Can you tell me more about your photography?
Yeah, my photos are on the web, and there's a website called PhotoNet, So if you're interested in having a look at them, you're welcome to. In a nutshell, I don't take pictures of people because I look inside their brains all day, so I want to photograph something else. So I take pictures of nature and animals and landscapes and buildings and objects, and I try and take pictures of things that make other people think. So that's what I do, but I don't take people.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Rachel. Right, no, Rachel's going. She's going to do Lacey.
Hi, I'm Rachel, and who is your favorite famous scientist?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's a scientist that I'm not sure if you guys would know him. He's very famous in Australia. His name is Sir John Eccles, and he's not around anymore. But he was a scientist who worked in the 1940s and 1950s, and he was trying to understand how brain cells talk to one another. And there was a big argument at the time amongst scientists. Do brain cells talk via chemicals or do brain cells talk via electricity? And he always thought that brain cells talk via electricity. But he had people who didn't agree with him. So he set up a set of experiments to work out what really happened. How do brain cells talk to one another? And so he showed very clearly that brain cells talk to one another chemically. And why I really admire him, because that was the other part of your question, is he was wrong. He thought that he always thought that brain cells communicated via electricity. He was wrong, but he wasn't afraid to do the experiment to find out what was really happening. And that's why I admire him, because it takes a very big person to admit that they're wrong and to really be there to try and understand what's really going on with the science. So that's why he's my favourite.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Marissa.
Hi.
What is your favorite book as a child?
Oh, there's so many. I read a lot of books when I was a kid. But I think one probably stands out, and that would have to be one that you guys probably know too, and it's called The Hobbit by J.R. Tolkien.
Yep.
And you probably saw the movie and all of that. And I just remember when I was in 5th grade, and I'll never forget this, we used to go to the library once a week, and we had a teacher who was a librarian. His name was Mr. Peebles. And Mr. Peebles every week would read us a chapter of The Hobbit. And so we got really interested in The Hobbit, and totally, he was just amazing because he could really read well and make the story interesting. And I still get goosebumps when I think about him reading the voice of the Golem, that really nasty monster that was in the story. So that's my favourite book. What about you guys? You must have favourite books too.
Well, what do you like? What are a couple popular ones?
Anyone like The Hobbit?
My brother does.
Okay, so people have read The Hobbit. Cool. So we have something in common.
All right, cool. Rachel.
What is your favorite emoji and why?
Oh, you could probably guess, because I'm a scientist and I'm a brain scientist. So my favourite emoji is the brain emoji. That's my favourite one, and I use that on Twitter and I use it on my phone. But that said, I like all the facial expressions, and I often use those when I text and when I tweet. So what's your favourite expression? Or your favourite emoji?
Which emoji is your favorite?
I don't know.
Oh, pick one.
You got too many favourites, huh?
Yeah.
No. Sunglasses one.
I like the face one.
Everybody's got favourite faces by the sounds and favourite emojis, and I think I just use a lot of them because it just depends what you're texting or tweeting about, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds like it's tough for you guys all to squeeze in there, huh?
Everybody wants to be on the camera, so.
Did you see the movie Inside Out?
I didn't, and I feel really bad to say I didn't see it. Isn't that terrible? You know, I got a confession to make, because when I have a list of movies I want to see, and I wait until I travel and I go on these long plane flights and I've got nothing to do, and then I watch these movies. So, you know, I looked at your question about that, and yes, you're right, I should watch that movie. It's on my list of things to do. But I've got an answer for you. I still think, without seeing the movie, that I think those expressions are pretty real, because there's a scientist called Dr. Paul Ekman, and he actually was a consultant on the movie, and so he gave them advice as to how they should make the expressions real. So I think they're probably pretty real. What do you guys think? What did you guys think of the movie?
I watched it yesterday. I love Bing Bong. Oh yeah, Bing Bong.
Bing Bong? Okay.
Bing Bong. Bing Bong.
So do we think she should see it? Okay. Tell her, we think you should see it. Tell her after
Yeah,
she
I'm going
watches
to.
it,
In
if
fact,
she
I'm
could email
flying to
us.
Europe in a couple of weeks, and so I'm going to look for that on the movie list.
See if she can email us and tell us if she
Could
likes
you
it.
email us after you watch it and tell us what you like?
Sure. Sure.
Hi, my name is. Oh yeah. We have some overall science questions, if that's
Okay. All right.
Hi, my name is Maggie. As a professional scientist, do you still use the scientific method we learn about in the 5th grade?
You bet. I use it every day. I use it every day in my work, in the lab, when we're making new experiments and we're trying to make hypotheses and trying to understand, you know, something new about the brain. But I also use it at home. I use it at home when things aren't working, something's not working at home, my network goes out, or if I'm not well, I try and work out what's wrong with me. So I use it all the time. So even if you're not doing science, you can use this stuff at home to help you figure things out.
Can you give us an example of how you have used the scientific method to investigate a problem?
Well, for us, any experiment that we design with trying to understand something about expressions or something about facial movement, we have to work out what's been done before, so what's understood about the problem. So we'll go and look at the literature and see what other people have done. And then we, as a group in the lab, there's usually 5 or 6 of us, we talk and we design an experiment together. And so we argue about what would be the right way to do it relative to the question that we do. So science is a very kind of a group thing. It's not like I do that on my own. I do that with my students, and we are always talking to one another. We work together to collect data. We analyse it together. So we always, every day, we work together on that. So I hope that answers your question. I'm being general, but we just use it every day.
Okay.
Have you ever hurt yourself by doing an experiment?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I haven't hurt myself, but we're very, very careful about how we do things in the lab. Particularly, we sometimes we measure electrical activity in the brain on people, and we also measure their blood flow, and that means we put them in an MRI scanner. And that means that we have to take precautions to make sure that the people who do our experiments are safe, okay, and that they don't get harmed. So I personally haven't been hurt, but I have hurt myself preparing for a scientific presentation. I've fallen down some stairs and sprained an ankle and had to give my talk on crutches. So yes, I have hurt myself doing science, but not in the way that you probably expected.
Well, and have you ever made a mistake in the lab, and what did you learn from the mistake?
Okay, that's a really good question, and there are multiple levels of answer to that. If you say, we all make mistakes, I mean, we're human. if you make mistakes where you're being careless about your method and you're being sloppy and not working very well, that's not okay to make mistakes when you're working like that. But where it's okay to make mistakes is when you do follow the scientific method we were just talking about. And when somebody makes a hypothesis, we do a careful experiment, everything's done carefully, and things don't work out in the way we want them to. So we've made a mistake, if you will, about how we did our experiment. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because then we've probably learned something new. Okay, we've learned something new. Many of you have probably heard of that. Remember the famous mathematician Albert Einstein? He's a very famous man. Well, he once said that if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. Okay, so most of the time we don't really know, we're doing stuff in the unknown, so we're going to make mistakes. And making mistakes is a big, big part of science. So yeah, mistakes are important. And in fact, in science, there are many discoveries that are accidental. And people have kind of made a mistake and found something really cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have some questions about expressions and microexpressions.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Alina. Why is it important to study expressions and microexpressions?
Okay, well, the face and the body it's a communication tool. Other people tell us so much about themselves with the face. So it's really good for us to know and understand how people communicate with one another. It's also good to understand how people communicate and how their brains go about reading that information, because sometimes people have disorders of communication, and that way maybe we can try and help work out how those people can communicate better. So that's why I think it's important to study all of these things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Garrett. Which emotion is the hardest to read?
Ooh, that was a tough one, because I looked at that question and I was agonizing over that one. I would say probably happiness. And the reason I would say that is that when I look at somebody, I look at what their face does, what their voice does, and what their body and their hands do, and what their words are saying. And all of that's got to match for me. So I think it's hard. Sometimes we're with friends and we feel a bit down, and our friends want us to be happy, and so we try and sort of buck up and be happy, but they know that we're not really happy, right? Because they're using all of that information, not just from the face. What about you? What do you think is the hardest face to do? Because you practiced those expressions, didn't you, from those videos? Yeah, I can see some of those expressions there. Cool. It's hard, isn't it, to work out which one is.
I gotta say anger, because, like, a lot of people look different when they're angry.
True, that's true. And sometimes, though, they look different when they're angry, because the amount of anger that they have can be varied. And so when people are just a little bit angry, they might look different to when someone's really, really, really angry, right? That's probably why they vary so much. It's the same thing with happiness too. Sometimes people can be happy, they just smile and they don't show their teeth. But then somebody who's really, really happy will have, the whole face will light up and teeth will show and everything. So there are different degrees of emotions, right?
Also, which emotion is the hardest to fake?
I don't know. I'd probably put my money on happiness again. What about you? What do you guys think?
What's the hardest thing to face?
Scared.
Fear. They think fear.
Yeah, okay, that's a good one.
But I was scared my teeth. Yeah, same.
Yes, that's a good point. You make a really good point because some of those emotions, things change in our faces. Like we get pale or we get red and so on, and that's very hard to fake, isn't it? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Emma.
I am.
Hi, I'm Melissa. Does the knowledge about facial expressions affect the social life?
I'd like to think not. But as I said to one of you earlier, I kind of look for a match between what people are saying, what their words say, what their voice says, and what their face shows as well. So for me, everything's got a match, and then I kind of believe them. So.
Do you ever get in fights with friends because you know they're lying? Can you tell how people are feeling when they're talking?
Yeah, that's a tough one because sometimes people don't always want you to know how they feel, and sometimes they don't feel comfortable about telling you why they feel in a certain way. And I think we have to be respectful of one another and consider, that person's point of view. And it's something we forget about sometimes. So I try and not invade that person's space, and if they want to tell me, they can tell me about how they really feel. But I respect them, and if they want to tell me, they will. And so I tend to back off a bit, and I think that always, if you have that approach, you won't get into trouble with other people.
Can you tell how people are feeling when they are far away from you?
Well, that's an interesting question. Did you guys look at I don't know how much time you were able to look at the videos that I sent, but did you look at some of those videos with the dots and the biological motion?
When it goes backwards.
Okay, so were you able to see how, just with those few dots, you could work out if someone was happy or sad? Could you tell?
Yeah. When they're sad.
Yeah. And you don't even know who it is. That's the most amazing part about it. You can just look, you don't even see a person, it's just a collection of dots moving, and you can work it out. That's amazing. So our brains are pretty cool like that. We're really wired into to tune into how other people are feeling, even though we're not concentrating on that, but our brains are telling us how other people are feeling. That's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please.
Which brain system tells your emotions to spring into action?
That's a good question. It just depends on, we're always taking in input from the outside world. And depending on what kind of input we get, that's going to kickstart multiple systems in our brain. For instance, if we feel like something's dangerous or threatening, that's going to kickstart our fear systems in the brain. Areas like the amygdala, I don't know if you've heard about that area, but that's one that makes people very fearful and makes people respond when there's a threatening situation. Sometimes when we take in information that makes us angry, we see somebody being harmed or someone treated unfairly, it might make us angry or unhappy. So it just depends on, our brain has lots of filters, so it looks at continually what we're seeing, and then that's going to kickstart different systems that make our emotions happen. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it's sort of it depends very much on what's coming in from the world outside for us. So we're very flexible like that.
Can you tell what someone's emotion is by how they walk?
I think you can, and I think if you think back to those videos with those dots that you guys looked at, right? you could tell if people were anxious or if they were kind of sad or whatever, and you can tell. You can certainly tell what one of your friends is like when they're walking and they're not happy or they're afraid, and you can also tell from strangers too. So you can certainly tell that from the body.
Can emotions affect what you hear or see or see?
Emotions can be a filter on how we see the world, and sometimes we might miss some things and we focus on others. And sometimes there are people who have phobias, say, they have fears about certain things in the world. Well, they might be so focused on their fears in the world that they might be completely missing something else. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So we our emotions filter what we see in the world. It's a funny thing to think about. So I try and be happy, but not always. But happiness can also make us miss things that are important.
Hi, I'm Jesse.
Hi, Jessie.
We discussed an article in class about Meghan Markle's royal training with the British Air Service. She is being trained to survive a hostage situation. The article states that she is being taught to psychologically manipulate her captors and how to use coded microexpressions, such as subtle words and other signals to let either her family or law enforcement know she's under duress. Can you give us an example of how they might train her to do this?
Yeah, that's interesting. That was a fascinating story in the media. It was really, really interesting. I think what they're probably doing is they're probably doing training with her where they're in an interview situation and they've got a camera on her. Not unlike what we've got on Skype here. Like you guys are on camera, I'm on camera, and they're asking her to do things, to read text or something like that. Not unlike you just did when you read the question to me. And they're trying to get her to know how to signal distress or trouble with subtle changes in their face. And, when you look at the micro-expressions are really quick. They're very, very brief things. It's very, very hard to train your face to do that. And those of you who are practicing, making emotions with those videos, it's pretty easy to make an emotion and make it and let it last. But when you've got to do something that's over in a fifth of a second, that's really hard. So she's probably, they probably gave her some training. There are these training videos of micro-expressions that you can do and that you can learn to recognise. And they're probably training her to also make those expressions, kind of what you guys did when you were looking at those training videos. And then they probably make her do these interviews on camera, and then they probably make her watch the interviews themselves to see how she's doing. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But I'd really like to know what they actually do, but that's what I'm guessing they do. Hi.
I am Owen. How do you use your research in the real world?
Well, I probably, as I said, when I interact with people and people that I don't know, I look for whether their facial actions and their body actions match their words and their voice. And that's probably how I use what I do in the real world the most.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have some questions about applying your research to people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. How do you read the expressions of people with autism when in their eyes they see emotions differently and they sometimes show emotions differently?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The folks with autism are a very interesting bunch of people to study, and there are multiple issues there. They often have difficulty with recognizing other people's emotions and feelings, and that is partly because emotions in everyday life change so quickly, and you know, you smile, and then in a fraction of a second the conversation goes on, and so they might have missed that. They might have never looked in the right place to see that, and they've missed it, and so that's a big problem for them. And people who have autism, we know that when they look at somebody's face, they look at it differently. They like to avoid looking at the eyes, and they just like to typically look more at the mouth or the nose. And the eyes often tell us a lot of important things: where the person's looking, who they're attending to, and also it can tell us about emotions. And so if they're not looking in the right place, they're going to miss all those important social cues. So that's one aspect. So they're not getting the right information in from the environment. Two, they often don't understand a social interaction, so they don't know how they can participate. Okay, and so they have emotions themselves, but they just mightn't be able to express them appropriately to other people. So it's a tough world for them sometimes. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Chrissy.
Okay, Chrissy.
Do you ever use your work to help people with autism understand other people's facial expressions and body movements?
That's a good question. I personally haven't been testing people with autism, but I've been, our work shows that the way our brains look at the eyes and the mouth part of the face are very different. And so this has meaning for people who have autism who, as I said earlier, look just at the mouth. And so I have a friend and a colleague here at IU called Dan Kennedy who studies people who do who studies people with autism. And so we talk a lot about this. So my work impacts his work. So even though I directly don't study people with autism, I'm very, very interested, and I read the literature. The other thing is people who have schizophrenia also have difficulty communicating with people sometimes. And so I have some work going on with researchers at another university, and it's directly looking at people with schizophrenia and how they read the emotions of others. So there are a number of different disorders that people have with recognizing emotions.
I was also wondering if you want to help teachers of students with autism better understand the students.
I haven't, but we have had a number of students in Dan Kennedy's lab, and they have interacted with people who have autism, and they are working with them to help to try and learn them, to teach them to communicate better and interact socially and recognize some of those cues that you guys would automatically see that those folks might miss, as I was telling you earlier. So they work with those folks to get them to look at the eyes and get them to interact in certain ways with people to try and make the social interaction more meaningful. Mm-hmm.
In the video of the rubber hand experiment, people's brains were rewired to make them believe that the rubber hand was theirs. Could you use this type of therapy to help people with autism rewire their brains to help read and show emotions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Really, really good question. I had to think long and hard about that one. We have to, if we really knew what was going on under the hood in these people, then we could maybe make a manipulation like that. But right now we're not totally sure. So I would probably say no at this point, but it's a good idea, and it's something that I think we're learning about more. As I said, my friend Dan Kennedy is doing a lot of cool stuff with people who have autism, and so I think in another 10 years we might be able to do some things like that, but not right now. But it's a good question.
Hi. Almost all people with autism have a hard time get by close to understanding what parts of the brain are affected by autism?
Yeah, definitely. That's what we're doing with, some of our. We're not just looking at emotions. We're looking at facial movements and how the body moves and the hands move as well. So yeah, definitely. That's where my work is geared towards. I'm trying to understand how our healthy brains do it and how people who also have disorders might do it. So definitely, yeah, that's a means to an end for us.
Cool. If you are able to identify this, would you potentially be able to treat autism?
Yeah, there's two sides to this coin. Yes, you can certainly potentially get a method together to help people with autism interact socially with others. But there's the other side of the coin. There are a lot of people who have autism who say, I'm pretty happy the way I am, and I really want other people to learn how to better communicate with me. So the other side to that coin is, let's learn how these people communicate and let's adjust our behaviour so that we can make our communications with them meaningful. And it's a two-way street. So that's if my work can ultimately do that, I'll be very happy.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Daria.
Hi.
My name is Michael.
I'm Michael.
How do you pick facial expressions on people that have Down syndrome?
People with Down syndrome, they have facial expressions that they form just like we do. People who don't have Down syndrome. You can tell if someone with Down syndrome is extremely happy, if they're upset. Their face might look a little bit different to ours, but they can make all of those same expressions with the muscles of their face. And it's amazing. I don't know if you guys have ever looked at a face, just like a horror movie, but if we were to peel the skin off my face, I'd have like a zillion muscles on my face, and we could make so many different facial emotions with all of our muscles, things that so many different kinds of faces. These guys can do the same thing, so they have no problems generating those kinds of expressions.
What about any other disorders?
That's a good question. Sometimes if somebody has a stroke where they have a brain injury, sometimes people lose the ability to move parts of their body, and that can also include the face. And so then they have trouble making emotional expressions and communicating. And then there are other forms of brain injury where that can happen, right? And so, for instance, people who you've heard of Parkinson's disease. Okay, it's a disorder of movement as people get older and things in their brain degenerate. They have trouble moving, and they also have trouble moving their face. And people often say, "Oh, he looks depressed," or he's not happy. Well, he's actually okay. He just can't move his face. And there are some disorders where people have a paralysis of this. It's responsible for a lot of our movements. Sometimes it can be injured. And you guys are breaking up a little bit. Okay, we're good now. And that can be injured, and so that you lose the ability to move the muscles of your face. And Botox, that's another one. You heard about Botox? When people inject stuff into their foreheads and stuff to get rid of wrinkles. Well, that can kind of change the way they can't make certain expressions of the face because those muscles are paralysed. So there's all sorts of stuff like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If you could tell what some
describe how they walk. What happens when people are unable to walk due to a disability?
Yeah, well, we use our body, our torso, our arms and our face, right, to convey emotion. And think about it, when you guys are sitting in class, you're all sitting and you're not walking, but you can tell when somebody's happy or sad or mad or whatever, right? You don't have to be walking around. So you are still, all of you are still sending cues from your body and your hands and your face. So you don't necessarily need to see somebody walking to work out what's going on up here. Okay?
Are there any illnesses where people appear to be emotionless? If so, are they really emotionless, or does it just seem that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we talked about that a few minutes ago when I was talking about people who have brain injuries where they can't make the emotion with their face. But that doesn't mean that they don't feel it. They just can't show the rest of the world how they feel. And that must be really, really frustrating. And there are also, in the most extreme possible case, you've heard about these people with locked-in syndrome. Have you heard about that? These are these people who are lying in an intensive care unit and they can't move anything in their body, but they're completely aware. They can hear everything. They can only move sometimes their eyelids. Can you imagine being like that? That would be really scary.
We have some future questions.
Okay.
Questions about the future.
Okay. Hi.
Do all expressions have their own set of? Do all animals have their own set of facial expressions?
I wish I could tell you the real answer to that. I don't know. I just look at my two cats at home and, we look at people's dogs, and animals clearly feel emotion. It's just they can't talk to us and tell us. And but I think they certainly feel fear. I think they can certainly feel anger. They can be contented. They just can't tell us. What do you think? Do you have a pet? Do you guys have pets? Yeah? What do you think? Do you think they can feel emotion? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a tough one.
Why is all this emotion different from Can people affect animals' facial emotions?
I think we can. Think about the time when, as you guys have all got pets, when you pet your pet and your pet responds to that, you're changing how your pet feels, aren't you? Changing their emotional state, and it probably feels contented. Think about all those poor animals at the animal shelter, rescue dogs and cats, right? They've probably had a pretty terrible life, and you bring home one of those animals and they're very fearful, right? And so people who bring home rescue animals, they have to work very, very hard to help these animals get over their fears, and eventually they're not fearful anymore. So we can certainly affect animals' emotions.
Are wild dogs' emotions different from house pet dogs' emotions?
I don't know. See, I'm not an expert on this, but I had a student once who was looking at dogs and how they interacted with humans, and she thinks that if she was here sitting next to me, she'd probably tell you that they're probably the same, I'm guessing, because they will feel fear, they'll feel threatened. Wild dogs often hang around in packs, okay? So they're used to interacting in a group. Your pets at home are also used to interacting in your family group, where you are the top dog, right? You're the boss, okay? So they're used to taking directions from you. So they probably have the same emotions and the same kinds of behaviours.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. it's an excellent question. I would probably take a stab in the dark and say no, but I go back to what I said earlier. All those muscles on our face, we can make lots of interesting expressions, and that means we can make mixtures of different expressions. We can be surprised, but we can be happy when we're surprised. We can be fearful when we're surprised, right? So we can blend and mix those emotions, and so that means that we can have so many different kinds of emotions. Okay, so you can, when you guys practice making your emotions again, think about happy surprise and fearful surprise, and think about how the two might be different from one another.
What would happen if everyone had different facial and body movements to show their emotions?
That would be terrifying, because I don't think we'd know what anybody wanted or what they were doing. What do you think would happen?
The world would be chaotic.
Yeah.
By now.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. All right.
Hi, I'm asking, what are you going to research about life?
Ooh. It's always fun thinking about what we're going to do in the future. We've already started doing some new studies on emotions in crowds, big groups of people. And why is that important? Because we look at groups of people and crowds every day. There's a big group of people looking at me right now through this camera. And I have to work out what you're all thinking and feeling. And so it's very different to doing that for one person versus a group of people, and working out what the mood of that group of people is. So that's what we're doing, because there are people who have disorders of social anxiety, so they don't even want to go outside. They're afraid to go out and interact with groups of people. So that's what we're doing next. Emotions in crowds. Mm-hmm.
I'm Jasmine, and what advice do you have for children who want to become scientists when they grow up?
Ah, that's an important question. I think that you need to do what you're good at. And this applies to not just doing science. If you're good at things like art, or if you're good at things like languages, and if you're good at things like, science, you should follow that and follow that dream that you might have, because if you do and you're good at it, you'll probably be successful at it. And then you'll get paid for doing what you want. I'm very lucky. I get paid to go to work every day. I'm really happy doing what I do. So I just hope that all of you can find what you're good at and what really makes you feel happy. And whether it's science or whether it's something else, that's the important thing. So I have a question for you guys now that you're done with the questions. How many people are going to do science in this class? Oh.
Does doctoring count?
Yeah, that counts.
Yeah, that counts. Cool. Archaeology, that's a good one too. Astronomy, cool. Geology, wow. Lots of budding scientists here. And budding doctors as well. Doctors are scientists too. Cool. So everyone's really science-based. Yes, you have a hand up and you're making hand movements at me. You were just trying to get my attention. Okay, so we did it. We got through all the questions.
We did. What do you say, ladies, up front?
Thank you. I had a wonderful time too.
What can we say?
Have a great holiday.
You too.
What can we say?
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, thank you.